And now Tom Speth from the Office of Research and Development will help moderate the webinar and introduce the speakers.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm here with Katie Massey and Michelle Latham, and we're here. Welcome to EPA's monthly webinar system for small systems. Today's topic is harmful algal blooms, treatment, risk communications toolbox, and management plans. Before we start, we have a couple of things, housekeeping issues. Toward the bottom of this slide is the webinar support tool and a webinar support number that you can call, and if you're having webinar problems. Also, the recordings of this webinar can be found on the website at the very bottom of this page. And we are glad to offer a certificate for one continuing education contact hour for viewing this webinar live. So with that, the requirements for receiving the certificate are you must be registered for the live webinar or be in a room with someone who is registered. You must attend for all 60 minutes. If you're in a room with others, the names of people not logged in must be provided by the person who is. So send the names to that that address right there in number 3. If you did not receive the credit at registration, send in an email request to the webcast info address or respond to your registration confirmation email. Again, these certificates can't be provided for viewing the webinar recordings, but just watching the webinar live with us. If you're interested in downloading the slides for today's talk, you can find them in the handout box located in the dialog box on your screen. Also, if you have questions for the speakers, which we encourage, please type them in the questions box in that same dialog box. Feel free to do this while the speakers are talking. It'll help us organize the questions for later because we'll ask the questions after the second speaker has finished, in this case, Nick Dugan. Again, if you missed the poll question earlier and you have more than one person in your room, please type that number into the questions box. It'll help us document how many people are attending the webinar. This large attendance helps us justify continuing this program. And also, if you have any stories on how this webinar helps your organization, also include that if you could. We'd love to hear about that. So with that being said, I think we can move on to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Hannah Holstinger from the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Hannah is a physical scientist and current cytotoxin team lead for the drinking water program within EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. In addition to her cyanotoxin work, she works on the microbial contaminant candidate list and has previously worked on the endocrine disruptor screening program and the Legionella support document on treatment technologies for premise plumbing. Hannah has a BS in Biological Sciences with a second major in Food Science and Technology from Virginia Tech and a Master's of Public Health from the University of Kentucky. And with that, I will pass the podium over to Hannah.
Thanks, Tom. Let's see if I can get my screen bigger. All right. Let me know if you can't see my slides. Hopefully they're showing. So I'll be talking a bit about cyanotoxin risk management for drinking water systems and some of the tools EPA has recently released to help support these efforts. I'll begin by giving a brief overview of harmful algal blooms and cyanotoxins and some of their drinking water impacts. I'll talk about some of EPA's recent and ongoing HAB-related activities in drinking water, as well as go into a more in-depth discussion of a few key support tools for managing cyanotoxin risks in drinking water. So cyanobacteria naturally occur in surface waters, and under certain conditions they can rapidly form blooms, often referred to as harmful algal blooms or HABs. Some of the leading causing factors of blooms include excess nutrient loadings and concentrations, specifically phosphorus and nitrogen, slow-moving waters, as well as elevated water temperatures. Some of these cyanobacteria species are capable of producing toxic compounds known as cyanotoxins, or sometimes referred to as algal toxins. Some of the significant impacts of HABs include adverse human health effects, adverse ecosystem impacts from the toxins as well as the hypoxia that can form, drinking water and recreational water quality concerns, as well as a large amount of economic losses. Some of the HABs-related specific drinking water challenges include, for drinking water quality, some of the problems can include taste and odor issues, human health effects from ingesting toxins such as GI illnesses and liver and kidney toxicity, as well as there's the potential development for increased disinfection byproducts. Some of the challenges for public water systems include an increasing operational cost due to trying to manage blooms in their source water. There could be additional research needed for these systems on how to best prevent, predict, analyze, monitor, and treat for toxins, as well as working to develop and implement cost-effective strategies to help prevent HABs from occurring in the source water, as well as how to determine how to communicate the risk to the public, as it can be quite complicated with these. Some highlights from the recent past few bloom seasons. In 2015, the Ohio River had a 600-mile bloom, and this is a source for drinking water for over 5 million people. Lake Erie, in addition to the Toledo shutdown in 2014, they also had in 2015 the most severe bloom of the century on Lake Erie. In Florida in 2016, there's a severe impact to Lake Okeechobee as well as the rivers and estuaries. In 2016, Utah Lake, there was a severe bloom, and although this is not a source of drinking water, it caused quite an issue with the recreational as well as secondary water impacts such as irrigation, gardening, and livestock. And there's been, this is just a couple of the examples of drinking water defects in 2016. This list is not meant to be exhaustive by any means. Ingleside, Texas, and in early 2016 had a drinking water advisory. Des Moines, Iowa has had defects in finished water last year, as well as Cayuga County in New York. As well as this year, we've been hearing reports from the state of Washington that a non-public water system, although the source is used for drinking water, they're having issues. So this kind of illustrates that this is an issue all across the country. Some recent key OW Office of Water cyanotoxin drinking water activities include the release of the health advisories for two cyanotoxins, Microcystis and cylinder spermopsin in 2015, as well as simultaneously there's a release of a recommendations document for public water systems to manage cyanotoxins in drinking water, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later. As well as in 2015, EPA released the Algal toxin risk assessment and management strategic plan for drinking water submitted to Congress, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And last year, EPA included cyanotoxins on the contaminant candidate list, as well as included cyanotoxins, 10 cyanotoxin contaminants or group of contaminants on the fourth unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. And the UCMR4 monitoring is set to begin in 2018. I'll talk about some of the recent EPA drinking water tools in my next few slides, as well as one other activity EPA has been working on is having regional HAB workshops to help bring together the clean water and drinking water side to discuss this issue that crosses both sectors. Some of the recent EPA OW HAB-related activities, and I'll go into these in further detail in the next few slides. This is just to kind of highlight where I'll be going. The cyanotoxin management plan template and example plans, water treatment optimization for cyanotoxins, the cyanotoxin risk communication toolbox, so the funding fact sheet for HABs. There's been recent method development, and EPA has also been working to promote Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act integration and source water protection strategies, as well as working with source water collaboratives and partnerships. So I'll begin to talk about the cyanotoxin management plan template. So this template is a framework based on the 2015 recommendations document, and it provides a framework to inform public water systems as they develop their own cyanotoxin management plans as they deem appropriate. And along with the template was included 5 example cyanotoxin management plans. So here we worked with 5 different public water systems that provided, in working with these 5 public water systems to develop their own cyanotoxin management plans, they provided really great insights to help tweak this framework as it was based on the previous recommendation document. So we kind of tweaked it based on working with these 5 systems in real-world situations. And so again, this is just a tool to help systems if they choose to develop a cyanotoxin management plan, or if they choose to incorporate this cyanotoxin risk management within their overall operational plans, this can be a tool to help provide some support. This slide shows an example of one of the frameworks from one of the public water systems that we worked with. And again, this is just an example, and I'll go through some of these steps in the next slide. But recognizing that this 5-step process, it's really going to be the most appropriate course of action is really going to vary system by system. Some systems we worked with chose to just skip some of the steps, so it really depends on what is best for the system. Here's an overview of what's in the template. It goes through an executive summary, and so here's where a system can provide a brief overview of their system and their source waters, understanding how vulnerable the source water is, when the source water is vulnerable, putting in place of understanding if there's other systems using the same source water that could provide information that could be useful. Then moves into a 5-step process. This is moving through step 1, assess the source water, and this goes through the vulnerability, really understanding the source water. Step 2, preparation and monitoring for early warning signs and immediate actions. So this can be preparation of many different activities, really recognizing that this plan is really meant to be a proactive plan, something to put in place to prevent toxins from even occurring in the finished water, but as well as, if an emergency does arise, this can be used as a go-to plan that's already been put in place prior to the bloom season. But begin by the preparation can involve ordering any necessary lab equipment, setting up any necessary lab contracts, making sure you have any treatment materials as necessary, as well as going forward and looking for understanding when you might have blooms and going forward and looking for when you might have blooms. So this could be a visual, seeing if you have blooms near your intake in the source water, or if you're seeing any treatment impacts such as shortened filter run times or increased chlorine demands, things that might indicate something's going on in the event that you're not able to visually inspect your source water all the time, or if the bloom, as they are able to move throughout the water column, it might not be visible. Going on to, if you think you have a bloom, moving into step 3, raw water cyanotoxin monitoring and treatment adjustments. And if you're finding the toxins in the raw water, move on to monitoring of the finished water, as well as continuing treatment adjustments. And then step 5, if you're continuing to find toxins in the finished water, including any additional treatment adjustments, additions, and at that time, as the system deems appropriate, any public communication that may be necessary to help the public help protect public health. The template also goes into different outlines, a place for systems to describe any possible long-term activities to help prevent or mitigate impacts from blooms and toxins in drinking water. So this can involve any long-term possible treatment upgrades, any long-term working with the watershed and other source water managers to try to help prevent the blooms from occurring in the first place. So this template overview kind of includes many different options for how a system might determine their most appropriate course of action. So in order to provide a broad range of example plans, again, we partnered with 5 utilities in these treatment systems. They were all using different source waters. There was a variety of source waters. Some were on rivers, some were on lakes and reservoirs. There was a variety of locations. They were all across the U.S., as well as a variety of treatment system sizes. There was also a variety of treatment within the system. Some had the capability of using PAC, some had GAC, pre-oxidation. So these example plans can be used as just an example if a system wants to see how some other systems are managing their risks. EPA has also developed a risk communication toolbox. So this is meant to be a ready-to-use one-stop shop for communicating risks of cyanotoxins in drinking water. And this is recognizing that throughout the risk communication plan, there's going to be lots of communication going around. And so there's the communication within the risk management plan can involve communicating with your primacy agency, any local health authorities, as well as the public. And so this toolbox was created to help the public water system or local and state governments to communicate with the public. So that is what these tools are geared towards. So the audience of the tools is the public, meant to be used by a public water system or local state government as appropriate. And within this toolbox, there's a variety of tools beginning with templates. And so these are editable documents. We want systems to be able to tweak these or to edit these as necessary, depending on the messages the system wants to communicate. And this includes some press releases, drinking water advisory notices, social media and text alerts. And again, these are all editable. There's also some general information, including, and these are not editable but could be co-messaged or co-branded as appropriate. This is public messaging, frequently asked questions, and fact sheets. And so there's a couple different fact sheets. As you saw on the previous slide, there's a trifold that's just more general information on what are cyanotoxins, what do they mean, just a really general messaging, as well as some more specific, more focused into. These can be tools that you can use if in the event that there is a cyanotoxin event that the public should be aware of in the drinking water system. They're much more specific as to understanding what's going on. And some of the more general fact sheets, they can be used at any point in time if the system wants to be proactive about communicating. If they've had blooms or if consumers have noticed blooms in their source water and had questions, these can be tools for the public water system. And FAQs can be used as well for the system to help answer any questions they may get coming in. There's also a menu of multiple downloadable options of graphics, and here's 3 examples that you can see. The health advisory levels were used as examples, just used as examples. Again, systems can choose the most appropriate course of action for them. But here is, we worked with a variety of folks to develop these, the risk communication toolbox materials, including CDC, some states, some public water systems, as well as American Public Health Laboratories and ASWA. We worked with a lot of folks in developing these and reviewing these. So these can provide a visual example of what the information you're trying to convey within the fact sheets. And again, there's quite a large variety. I think there's quite a few. And just to note also that the risk communication toolbox, many of these materials are also available in Spanish. So they are also up on our website in English and Spanish. So I'll move on to give a quick overview. So we also last year released, or early this year released, a funding fact sheet for harmful algal blooms and drinking water systems. And so this is just a quick fact sheet to help systems kind of understand where possible funding exists to help support their risk management of cyanotoxins, including the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and there's also some additional funding sources discussed outside EPA as well as inside, including some of the NRCS grants. And there's also gives a couple of different state examples of how they've used funding, different funding mechanisms to help support their risk management activities. And I'll go into just a brief overview of HR 212, the Drinking Water Protection Act, because I think this is probably an important topic to know as well, to be aware of. So in 2015, the Drinking Water Protection Act was signed by President Obama, admitting the Safe Drinking Water Act. It added a new section, Section 1459, and this directed EPA to develop and submit a strategic plan for assessing and managing risks associated with algal toxins in drinking water provided by public water systems. And EPA delivered this strategic plan to Congress in November 2015. And within the strategic plan, it included steps and timelines for assessing human health effects, developing a list of algal toxins of concern, publishing health advisories, assessing treatment options, developing analytical and monitoring approaches, summarizing the causes of HABs, as well as recommending source water protection actions and strengthening collaboration and outreach. And some of the activities that I just discussed that were released last year they're examples of how we're working to meet some of the goals that we discussed in the strategic plan. specifically helping to communicate the risks of cyanotoxins, how to help manage the risks of cyanotoxins. Another document I mentioned briefly gets to the assessing the treatment options, and this was the treatment optimization for cyanotoxins. That also is a really great resource to help understand how to optimize treatment for cyanotoxin removal. And all of these materials are available on our website, which I will give a link to after this last slide. This kind of goes into some of EPA's goals for to help support continued managing the risks of harmful algal blooms in drinking water, including working to improve the scientific understanding of HABs and cyanotoxin production. We're going to protect public health by identifying human health effects of the current and emerging cyanotoxins, as well as providing necessary technical assistance to utilities so they can help provide safe drinking water throughout with effective HAB and cyanotoxin treatment, as well as working towards preventing HAB formation with effective source water protection efforts and nutrient reduction strategies at the watershed scale. So really trying to hone in on preventing these blooms from occurring in the first place. And so here's a link to the two cyanotoxin websites at EPA. The first of which is the Cyanotoxins in Drinking Water website. So this is where you should go for all of the tools that I discussed today. This provides links to all of the tools, as well as EPA's overall CyanoHABs website, and that provides a lot of really great information. We just have this separate drinking water one just to really hone in on the drinking water tools that are so they're easy to find, as well as my contact. Please feel free to email me with any questions you may have. Again, we're hoping that these tools that we've put out can really help support utilities as they determine their best course of action to help reduce the risks from cyanotoxins occurring in drinking water. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. And before we move on to our next presenter, I do just have a couple of quick little reminders. If you haven't done so already, please just put the number of attendees with you if it's over 1 in the questions box. It's really helpful to keep tabs on exactly how many people are coming. And then kind of as an extension of that, we will be sending out a survey, hopefully by the end of the week, that we'll just ask simple questions on if you're getting anything out of the webinars or if you have any recommendations, if it's useful for training, that sort of thing. So when you do receive that, it would be really great to get some feedback.
Okay, great. Thanks, Katie. And also I should note that I'd also like to announce, I'll do this at the end, but on August 22nd through the 24th, the EPA will be sponsoring a small systems workshop here in Cincinnati, Ohio. So if you have an interest, it's again, it's a workshop geared towards state primacy agency people and the implementation of the rules for small systems. And that it's a great opportunity to network with the latest research that we can report out, and also it helps us a lot because it gets feedback on what research we need to do for the following year to help small systems. So with that, thank you so much again, Hannah, for your first talk, and our second speaker is Nicholas Dugan. Nick is an environmental engineer with the EPA's Office of Research and Development in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he specializes in drinking water treatment. In addition to his work with cyanobacteria, he has performed treatment studies to evaluate the control of cryptosporidium, nitrate, perchlorate, pesticides, and disinfection byproduct precursors. Nick has an MS in environmental engineering and a BS in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Cincinnati, and a BA in economics from Carleton College. So Nick, I'll pass the podium to you.
So I'll be speaking today about two treatment options for cyanobacteria toxins, and we're going to focus on permanganate, and we're going to focus on powdered activated carbon. And the reason that we're choosing to focus on those two treatment steps is that they're applied typically very early in the drinking water treatment process, and the kind of decisions that you make at that stage in the treatment process has the potential to exert a disproportionate impact on what happens downstream. And so potassium permanganate is permanganate, typically applied as potassium permanganate, is applied for taste and odor control, and it's also applied to control zebra mussels in the intake structures. And when potassium permanganate comes into contact with suspensions of intact cyanobacterial cells, it has potential to lead to the release of toxins from the cells into solution. Permanganate also has the ability to oxidize toxins once they are released into solution. Then powdered activated carbon is typically applied for taste and odor control, and it's also used to control seasonally for trace organics, and these include herbicides and insecticides. Powdered activated carbon also has the potential to adsorb cyanobacterial toxins that are released into solutions, and it also has the potential to reduce the concentration of permanganate in solution. So you have the potential for powdered activated carbon and permanganate, both of which have the potential to reduce toxin concentrations, but if they're both in there together, they do have the potential to kind of work across purposes a little bit. Before we launch into the rest of the presentation, we're going to go over some definitions. And whenever we mention ELISA in this presentation, we are referring to the enzyme-linked immunosubstrate assay, and we're referring to the commercially available kits that are sold on the market by a variety of manufacturers. And in this presentation, when we talk about toxins, we're talking about microsystems that have been quantified using a microcystin ADDA ELISA assay. So we're talking about toxins that have been quantified by looking at the ADDA functional group that's common to the 100 or so or more microcystin congeners that have been evaluated so far. When we talk about chlorophyll-a, we are talking about a pigment that is contained inside cyanobacterial cells. And this is a pigment that's kind of a critical component of the photosynthetic apparatus in cyanobacterial cells. When we talk about Cytox green, we're talking about a commercially available stain that will has the capability to penetrate damaged cell membranes, but that does not penetrate intact cell membranes. And so when the stain penetrates a damaged cell membrane, it will attach with genetic material contained inside the cell, and it will fluoresce green under blue illumination. The data that we're going to be presenting in the rest of this presentation is based on a set of trials that we did here in Cincinnati. And what we did is we were looking at the interaction of potassium permanganate, pH, powdered activated carbon, and turbidity on the release and the subsequent degradation of cyanobacterial toxins from intact cells of Microcystis aeruginosa. And we ran with a target concentration of about 1 million cells per milliliter. Then we looked at 3 different permanganate doses. We looked at 1, 2.5, and 5 milligrams per liter. We looked at 2 different pHs, 7 and 9. Then we looked at either adding no powdered activated carbon or the impact of adding 10 milligrams per liter of PAC. Then we looked at 3 different turbidities. We looked at 0.1 NTU, 5, and 20 NTU. The reason we varied the turbidity is because powdered activated carbon and permanganate, they're typically applied early in the treatment process where turbidities tend to be relatively high. And the inorganic and organic particulates in a suspension of turbidity have the potential to exert competing oxidant demand, with the compete for oxidant demand with the potassium permanganate. And we ran a total of, at all these different conditions with some duplication, we ran a total of 28 trials. Here's a picture of our experimental setup, and we ran this on a standard Fipsenberg jar tester, and so we had 3 large jars. The first was water with just permanganate, and that gave us an idea of our background oxidant demand for each trial. The second was water plus suspensions of Microcystis aeruginosa with no oxidant added, and this was our control jar. Then finally, we had a suspension of, we had water and a suspension of Microcystis aeruginosa, and we had water, Microcystis aeruginosa, and oxidant that we added at 1, 2.5, or 5 milligrams per liter. And we will refer to this throughout the rest of the presentation as our oxidant jar. And then we ran at we ran at, then we sampled the system at immediately prior to oxygen addition. We call that T = 0. Then we sampled at 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and 90 minutes after oxygen addition. And after we collected our 30-minute sample, in those trials where we looked at the impact of powdered activated carbon, what we did is we took an aliquot of suspension from our jars, either our oxygen jar or our control jar, and we put that into a separate smaller jar and then put that on its own stir plate and stirred it at the same speed that the bigger jars were stirring at. And then we added powdered activated carbon at a dose of 10 milligrams per liter. And that way we're able to separate out what happens in suspension of cells plus oxidant versus suspension of cells plus oxidant plus powdered activated carbon. Here is, in this slide, we're looking at kind of a typical set of results. And we're looking at what happens. What we're showing here is net extracellular toxin accumulation at pH 7, 1 milligram per liter dose of potassium permanganate, and a turbidity of 0.1 NTU. And we've got the time along the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the toxin concentration in micrograms per liter. And so first we'll look at the extracellular toxin concentration in the control jar. So this is, and what we'll see is that we went from extracellular toxin concentrations went from about 0.4 to about 1 microgram per liter by the end of the trial. Then in the oxygen jar, immediately prior to permanganate addition, we saw about 1 microgram per liter of toxin. And then at 15 minutes after permanganate addition, we saw that toxin concentration climb to about 20 micrograms per liter. So we can see a significant difference in the oxygen concentration in the oxygen jar versus control jar. Now we also looked at what we call combined toxin concentrations. And so this is what's in solution outside the cell, the extracellular toxin, plus what is still contained inside the cell. So we looked at it two ways. And we can see that things were reasonably stable in both the oxidant and the control jar over the course of the trial. And so then the question is, the question then was, how do we combine the data from all 28 trials and turn it into something where we can kind of look at it on one graph and maybe start to tease out some trends. And what we did is we did some data normalization. And the way we normalized the data, we did it two ways. And so the first thing we did is that at each sampling point, we calculated the CT. So at 15 minutes, at 30 minutes, and at 90 minutes, we calculated the CT. And we did that because in addition to tracking extracellular toxin, total toxin, chlorophyll, and cell membrane integrity with time, we also tracked the concentration of permanganate in solution. And so by doing that, we're able to calculate CTs at each sampling time. And the other thing that we did is we looked at the concentration of extracellular toxin in the oxygen jar. We divided that by the extracellular toxin concentration in the control jar. So we did a ratio. And so, for example, for this trial at 15 minutes, that ratio, it's about oxygen jar concentration is about 20, control jar concentration is about 1. So we have a ratio of about 20 oxygen to control jar ratio. And before we go further, we're just going to go over a really brief overview, just a refresher on how we calculate CT. Here we're looking at a curve of, we have time in minutes, and then we have the potassium permanganate concentration in milligrams per liter on the left-hand axis. And this was for a trial where we dosed at 2.5 milligrams per liter initially of potassium permanganate, and we see how that concentration drops as a function of time. And in this particular trial, at 15 minutes, we had an incremental CT of 34, and that works out to a cumulative CT of 34 as well. When we go at the 30-minute sampling time, from 15 to 30 minutes, we had an incremental CT of 25, and that then worked out to a cumulative CT of 59. Then we applied the same, we applied the same thing, the same methodology to 90 minutes, and we in this case had a cumulative CT of 113 milligram per minute per liter. So in subsequent slides, we're going to be looking at a lot of CTs. And but anytime you see a CT, this is basically fundamentally the concept that underlies that calculation. So here we're summarizing some data, and we're summarizing all the results at pH 7, and we're looking at, and along the x-axis, we're showing the cumulative permanganate CT, calculated the way we talked about in the previous slide. Then on the y-axis, we are looking at the ratio of extracellular toxin concentration in the oxygen jar to the extracellular toxin concentration in the control jar. So for example, if you have a number of 10, that means that the oxygen jar concentration of extracellular toxin was 10 times higher than what we saw in the control jar. Then we've also got things color-coded. So everything that's blue is for trials that were at a 1 milligram per liter initial permanganate dose. Everything that's yellow was initial permanganate dose of 2.5 milligrams per liter. And everything that's red was an initial dose of 5 milligrams per liter. Now, each of these line segments, and I'm spending some time here because we'll be doing this for a lot of subsequent slides, but each individual line segment corresponds to the time progression of one of our 28 trials, and either pH 7 or pH 9. And then the starting point of each line segment corresponds to the 15-minute sampling point, and the ending point corresponds to the, so the starting point corresponds to the 15-minute sampling event, and the ending point, the last point, corresponds to the 90-minute sampling event. Then finally, let's have a look at this green line, that horizontal line at a value of 1, and that divides, that's basically a ratio, that represents where the oxygen jar concentration is the same as control jar concentration. So any point above the line means that you have more toxin in solution in the oxygen jar compared to the control jar. Any point below the line means that you have less toxin in solution in the oxygen jar compared to the control jar. And just some takeaways from this particular slide is that when we had low initial permanganate doses correspond to the lowest range of cumulative of CTs, and we see that relative toxin concentrations that are anywhere from 20 to about 100 times higher than what we saw in the control jar. Then when we move to, then by the time we move to the highest, oxygen doses, that also corresponds to higher CTs. And it also corresponds to what we see is we see smaller increases initially in relative toxin concentrations. And we see that these toxin concentrations decrease significantly as a function of CT, so as time progresses in each jar test trial. And the mechanism that's going on here is that by the time you get to relatively high permanganate concentrations of 5 milligrams per liter, you have a fair amount of permanganate in solution all the way through the trial. And so what that means mechanistically is that you've got enough permanganate to do two things. First, the permanganate is stimulating some release of toxin into solution, and then there's also permanganate available to oxidize the toxin once it's gone into solution. Then one more thing before we move forward. When we talk about net extracellular toxin accumulation, what we're talking about here, what that means is that we've got toxin being reduced. We're talking about toxin being released from the cells into solution faster than the permanganate is able to oxidize the toxin once it goes into solution. And what we did here on this slide, we're looking at the net extracellular toxin accumulation at pH 7, and it is the same set of tests that we looked at in the previous slide. So this is a summary of all our pH 7 data. We have cumulative permanganate CT on the x-axis, and this time we have just a straight extracellular toxin concentration on the y-axis. So we don't have the benefit of looking at what's going on in the control jar, but what this lets us do is it lets us gives us just an idea, a gut feeling for what kind of actual toxin concentrations we're looking at. And so here at the lower permanganate doses, we were seeing anywhere from 20 to 50 micrograms per liter of toxin solution. And then by the time we got to the higher permanganate doses at the end of a 90-minute trial, we were down to 0.8 to 3 micrograms per liter of toxin in solution. Then now that we know So we know that toxin has the capability of being released from the cells into solution. And so the question is, what happens if you add powdered activated carbon at some subsequent point in the treatment process? And that's what we're going to look at in this slide. Here we're looking at the impact of powdered activated carbon addition for all our pH 7 trials, and we're looking at a pack dose of 10 milligrams per liter. And there's a lot going on this slide, and so we're going to spend some time just going over it. So each set of bars, each major set of bars corresponds to a permanganate, an initial permanganate dose of either 1 milligram per liter, 2.5 milligram per liter, or 5 milligrams per liter. Then within each group of bars, okay, so we've got the 3 different permanganate doses. Then these numbers here correspond to the permanganate residual that we measured immediately prior to the application of powdered activated carbon at 30 minutes. So for example, in trials where we added 1 milligram per liter of permanganate initially, but by 30 minutes we were at 0.1 milligram per liter or less. When we added 2.5 milligrams per liter of permanganate initially, then by the end of the trial we were at somewhere between 0.2 and 1 milligram per liter, by 30 minutes. When we added 5 milligrams per liter initially, then by 30 minutes, we were at 3.3 to 3.8 milligrams per liter of permanganate immediately prior to pack application. Then each bar shows the change. Each individual bar shows the change in extracellular toxin concentration from 30 minutes to 90 minutes. Then each number above each set of 2 bars represents the actual extracellular toxin concentration in solution at 30 minutes immediately prior to pack application. And let's see. And then the numbers, the colors correspond to turbidities. So anything that's blue is 0.1 NTU turbidity. Anything that's green is 5 NTU turbidity. Anything that's red is 20 NTU turbidity. Then within each set of 2 bars, each subset, the first one, the one that's got the diagonal across it, is no powdered activated carbon, and the second one is with powdered activated carbon application. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this set here. So we've got 20 NTU turbidity. We've got, and we're going to look at an example on the following slide, and just to help interpret what we've got going on here. So what we did, okay, so we have a permanganate dose of 1 milligram per liter. We have a permanganate residual at 30 minutes of 35 micrograms per liter. Then without powdered activated carbon, using the first bar in the pair, the change in extracellular toxin concentration from 30 to 90 minutes was plus 0.2 micrograms per liter. So to calculate the final extracellular toxin concentration at 90 minutes, you take 35 micrograms per liter plus 0.2 micrograms per liter. We have a final extracellular toxin concentration of 35.2 micrograms per liter. Then if you look at what happens with powdered activated carbon addition, that's the second bar in the pair. And the change in extracellular toxin concentration from 30 to 90 minutes is a decrease of 19 micrograms per liter. So the final extracellular toxin concentration is 35 micrograms per liter minus 19 micrograms per liter equals 16 micrograms per liter. Now we'll step back to the plot and just have a look at it. Okay, so going back and just, here's our, oops, wrong one. Is that right, or is it turning? No. my apologies. So now we're back at the summary for powdered activated carbon at pH 7. So just to go over this again. So for example, at 30 minutes, we had an extracellular toxin concentration of 35 micrograms per liter. Then in the jar where no powdered activated carbon was added, we had toxin concentrations go up by 2 micrograms per liter. So the final toxin concentration at T equals 90 is 35 plus 2 is 37 micrograms per liter. Then when we added powdered activated carbon, we had a 19 microgram per liter decrease in toxin concentrations. So 35 micrograms per liter minus 19 micrograms per liter gives us a 16 microgram per liter final extracellular toxin concentration. And so the takeaways from the pH 7 data is that adding powdered activated carbon will always help your situation. It's a very effective adsorbent of microcystins. And in the first set of bars, where there was very little permanganate in solution at the time the PAC was added, all of the work in reducing the toxin concentrations was done by the powdered activated carbon. Now let's go over here to the 5 microgram per liter data, and you can see, and we look at, there's no significant difference between what happened in the oxidant jar, the jar that had oxidant only, versus the jar that had oxidant plus powdered activated carbon. In both cases, over 30 minutes to 60 minutes, we see roughly equivalent removals of powdered of extracellular toxin. And what we're attributing that to is the fact that we have enough permanganate in solution to achieve pretty significant toxin reductions. And so in those cases where there was no PAC added, we have enough permanganate in solution to achieve pretty significant toxin reductions. And in those cases where PAC was added, the toxin reduction would be attributable to both the powdered activated carbon and residual permanganate. Here we're looking at net extracellular toxin accumulation at pH 9, and once again we have cumulative CT along the x-axis, and then we have the oxidant to control jar extracellular toxin ratios along the y-axis. Once again, everything over the green line means more toxin in solution compared to control. Everything below the green line means less toxin. And just to highlight, the toxin ratios at pH 9 at 2.5 milligrams per liter are lower than what we observed at pH 7. At pH 7, we saw oxidant control jar ratios that were about here. So at pH 9, we're seeing ratios that are about roughly an order of magnitude lower. Then going to going to the 5 milligram per liter permanganate dose, once again we're seeing responses that are lower than what we saw in the pH 7 jars, and we're also seeing what looks like maybe an increase in toxin concentrations of CT increases. We're still working on why that is. We suspect it has something to do with differences in permanganate chemistry at the higher pHs. Here we're looking at the impact of, we're summarizing the impact of powdered PAC addition at pH 9. Once again, it's a 10 milligram per liter PAC dose. And once again, we can see that at the powdered activated carbon has, it's a very effective adsorbent of extracellular microcystin, and the degree to which PAC adsorbed toxins when there was no permanganate in solution is it's driven very strongly by how much toxin was in solution prior to PAC addition. So when you have more toxin in solution, that drives more toxin onto the PAC. When there's less toxin in solution, typically you see less of being driven onto powdered activated carbon. And then by the time you get over to the 5, and you see the beneficial effect even here, also here at the 5 milligram per liter permanganate dose. And what we're seeing here, without PAC application, we're seeing the increases in toxin concentrations that we saw at higher CTs, where with PAC application, definitely muted that increase and definitely had a beneficial effect, sometimes up to almost 20 microgram per liter reduction in net toxin production and accumulation. Then let's move on to some indicators of cellular health. And here we're looking at chlorophyll-a concentrations. And just to review, chlorophyll is it's a compound inside cyanobacterial cells that is part of their mechanism for harvesting light and turning it into energy that the cell can use. And it's organized, this graph is organized the same way as our toxin summary graphs. And so anything above the green line corresponds to more chlorophyll in solution, more chlorophyll in the oxygen jar compared to the control jar. And anything below the green line corresponds to less chlorophyll in the oxygen jar compared to the control jar. Color scheme's the same. Blue is 1 milligram per liter permanganate dose. Yellow is 2.5 milligram per liter permanganate dose. Red is 5 milligrams per liter. And to interpret physically what's going on here, what we're seeing for the most part is that with the application of permanganate, by the end of our trials, by the end of a 90-minute trial, we're seeing decreases of anywhere from, we're seeing decreases of anywhere from 10% to almost 50%. We're seeing decreases in chlorophyll of anywhere from 10 to 50% after exposure to potassium permanganate. And here we're seeing it here we're looking at chlorophyll data at pH 9. And the one takeaway from this graph is that, first off, two takeaways. First off, adding permanganate always resulted in decreases in chlorophyll concentrations relative to the control jar. And these decreases, for the most part, are confined to somewhere between 5 and 20% decreases. And so they're a little bit smaller than the decreases that we saw for permanganate application at pH 7. Now we'll look at what happens, we'll look at the propensity of the cells to take up Cytox green stain. And so Cytox green stain, once again, is a stain that will permeate cells with damaged membranes. And in this graph, we're looking at the summary of data for pH 7. And so the way to interpret this graph is that anything above the green line means that you have a higher concentration of cells with damaged membranes relative to your control jar. Anything below the green line means you have a lower concentration of cells with damaged membranes in the oxygen jar relative to the control jar. And so the takeaway from this graph is that we are seeing significant increases by multiples. Typically, we're seeing significant increases in the proportion of cells, the number of cells with damaged membranes in the oxygen jar compared to the control jar. So the previous slide was pH 7, and this particular slide is a summary of what happens at pH 9. The physical interpretation is the same. The takeaway is that, for the most part, we're seeing lower increases at pH 9 than we saw at pH 7. We're seeing lower increases in the proportion of damaged cells at pH 9 compared to pH 7. So to summarize our results, dosing intact cells of Microcystis aeruginosa with potassium permanganate was associated with extracellular toxin with accumulation of extracellular toxins relative to the controls. So we saw more extracellular toxin after oxidation than we saw without oxidation. We observed the greatest extracellular toxin accumulations at low permanganate doses and CTs. The degree of accumulation of extracellular toxin was dependent on CT and on pH. And exposure to the permanganate definitely affected the interiors of cyanobacterial cells. We observed decreases in chlorophyll concentrations, and we observed an increase in cells exhibiting a loss of membrane integrity. Finally, the application of powdered activated carbon decreased the concentration of extracellular toxins. And in terms of what's the bottom line for a drinking water treatment plant, what we did here in this presentation is we kind of held out, we kind of showed a mechanism of what can happen when you add permanganate to a suspension of intact cells. And the impact of the permanganate on intact cells can vary for a lot of different reasons. It can vary by the nutritional status of the cell. It can vary by the strain of cyanobacteria. It can vary by the concentration of cells in suspension. And so what we want to get across here is that we'd like you to walk away being cognizant of just kind of the mechanism of what could happen, when you add permanganate to the cells. And so in your water treatment plant, the way to handle that is just to be aware and to be careful. And so if you have the capability, monitor for cyanobacterial biomass in your source water, monitor for cyanobacterial toxins in your source water, monitor for cyanobacterial toxins throughout the treatment process. And if you suspect that maybe you're seeing a release of toxins, consider interrupting your potassium permanganate application, or think through how long you could interrupt it for, and then think about adding powdered activated carbon if you're not adding it already, or increasing your powdered activated carbon dose if you're currently adding carbon. And that completes my presentation, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Toby Sainin and Samantha Smith, and thank you very much for your time and attention.